Hey guys, Mr.B here. So I've got this 92 Honda Civic, and I'm going to use this video as an example on how to check and also replace your vehicle's radiator. Of course, it'll be specific to this car, but it is common for radiators to leak. We've got our radiator right here. Obviously this little itty bitty thing because it's a Honda. You've got a tank right here on the top. Sometimes they're on the side as well. And of course, there's another tank on the bottom. Older radiators, the tanks are made out of brass, maybe even copper. This one's of course plastic, so it doesn't last forever. But to be fair, this is an original radiator from 92, so this is over 30 years old now. I've got my pressure tester hooked up here. What the pressure tester does is it allows me to pump up the system to whatever PSI it's supposed to handle. In this case, this system's designed to handle 16 pounds of pressure roughly. See here on the cap, that 1.1 stands for bar. Of course, never open when hot. Otherwise, you get a face full of hot coolant. And if you look at 1.1, that's roughly 16 PSI. So I'm gonna go ahead and pump this up. And then you'll be able to see where this is leaking from. And if there's any other leaks anywhere on the cooling system, like the upper radiator hose, maybe the lower radiator hose, that one right there. Maybe if there's an issue with a heater hose, there's some heater hoses in the back right there where those clamps are. Those are your heater hoses. Those have coolant flowing through them. Of course, we've got a thermostat, a coolant temp sensor. There's a whole bunch of leak points for coolant, and sometimes of course the radiator is one of them. All right, so I have it pumped up to roughly 16 PSI. What you want to look for is the pressure dropping, and obviously immediately this pressure is dropping right away, and this one's right up in the open. It's obvious. There's a hairline fracture along the tank here causing the radiator to leak. So it's time for a new radiator. To get this radiator out, we've got a bracket right here that kind of holds it in place. Clamp here for the upper radiator hose. We do have a cooling fan to work with. I'll probably try and remove this whole radiator cooling fan assembly as one unit. There's this little air baffle that might get in the way, but I doubt it. And then of course the coolant reservoir. First things first, I'm gonna want to drain the coolant. This little valve right here on the bottom of the radiator is what you can loosen up to. And you do want to properly dispose of this coolant when you're done. So of course, used coolant, you don't want to just dump it down the drain. I believe if you take this stuff to your local parts stores, they'll dispose of it, or really any automotive shop, but there might be a charge. Either way, I'm going to drain this. I'm going to put it into a bucket and I'm going to dispose of it properly. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to attempt to take this whole assembly out with this lower radiator hose attached. I could take off the whole plastic piece underneath, but I don't really feel like dealing with it. I'm going to take this piece off. Actually, I'm going to have to take that off. I can just remove that. I'm going to take the clamp loose for the lower radiator hose right there, take that off, weasel it out of the way, and try and take it all out as one assembly. So the other thing I have to deal with too is the transmission cooler lines. There is a cooler built into this radiator for the automatic transmission. So you can see down in here, we've got these hoses for the trans cooler. So I'm gonna have to take those clamps loose and remove those as well. All right, got everything ready to go back in. All the bolts are tight. The main thing with these clamps that I've noticed, really any of these style of clamps, is you can reuse them. But you want to make sure that they go back in the same spot that they came off on the hose. Otherwise, you'll wind up with leaks. If that, metal piece isn't quite lined up in the same spot, it won't clamp down on the hose the same as it did from the factory. So you could replace all the clamps if you wanted to with the adjustable ones with the screw, but sometimes that's not always necessary. So I just wanted to kind of give that pointer, and then I'm gonna go ahead and slip this whole assembly back in. So there's these rubber grommets here off of the old radiator. They go on the end right like that, and like that. Will fit down in those holes right there to keep it in place on the bottom. And honestly, I found it helpful just to put those in place before I even put the radiator down in there, otherwise they just fall off. The other thing too is when you're putting this radiator in, you want to be careful not to gouge up the fins too much. Otherwise it'll break apart and you'll have a leak. A little bit of a scrape won't necessarily kill it, but you just want to be careful not to force it in too much and really kind of let it go in nice and easy. All right, well here we are. I got the new radiator in, got that bracket back on, clamp back on, this hose is back in, that bolt's back on. The trans cooler hoses are back on the trans cooler lines. Everything's reattached up here. So everything's back together as far as the radiator is concerned. So the next step now would be to top off the coolant with a 50-50 mixture of antifreeze and water. I'm gonna pre-mix my own coolant because it's a little bit cheaper that way, but the main thing is you wanna put the right amount of antifreeze and water back in the vehicle when you're done. If there's too much water, then of course in the winter time it could freeze, it could ruin your radiator, ruin your engine block. Don't want that to happen. If there's too much antifreeze, it could sludge up and cause issues later on down the road. The other thing too is I'm gonna have to make sure to top off and check the transmission fluid. There's a dipstick back in there. I'll come back to that in a little bit later because of course I had the trans cooler lines off and we have a new trans cooler which is built into the radiator, so I'm gonna have to make sure to top off the trans fluid before I'm done. I'm gonna use the universal all makes all models coolant. I end up mixing this myself because it's the full concentrate, so I do have a jug here of 50% water, 50% antifreeze, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and top off the radiator. The main thing is you want to make sure that there's no air bubbles in the system when you're done. So luckily on this car there is actually a bleeder screw right there, so if I pop that loose it'll allow a lot of the air bubbles to come out as I'm filling the coolant. It might not get all the air bubbles out though, so what I like to do after I'm done topping it off is let the vehicle run, let it get up to operating temp, and you always want to keep an eye on the coolant temp gauge when you do that, because if it overheats, you don't want it to overheat. And then I like to let it cool down and then check the coolant afterwards, so that way if there's any air bubbles it makes its way up out of the system and then you can top it off later. Here we go. Now there's coolant seeping out of that bleeder screw, so go ahead and tighten that up. All right, so now I got the engine running. I'm gonna let it run for a while, let it warm up, then shut it off, let it cool down. Definitely don't want to open the cap when it's hot. And then after it's cooled down, I'll double check the coolant level. All right, so one last step. I've got the engine running, checking the trans fluid. And luckily the trans fluid level is perfect. Transmission's hot now. This vehicle's been running for quite a while. And it is well within the right range on the dipstick.